America's largest mansion begins in winter. December 1895. Snow settles over the Blue Ridge like ash after a fire. The mountains beyond Asheville stand silent, their ridgelines veiled in white, their forests breathing pine, smoke, and cold. Up a road, past gates meant to signal distance as much as privilege, a vast stone residence comes into view. Not a house, not even a mansion. Something closer to an American castle imagined by a family wealthy enough to mistake desire for destiny. Biltmore rises from the hillside in limestone and slate, all towers, steep roofs, carved ornament, and disciplined excess. The scale is difficult to grasp until you begin naming it. 4 acres beneath one roof. Dozens of bedrooms. Scores of fireplaces. A banquet hall with the proportions of a chapel, a library. Everywhere signs of cultivated taste and industrial age confidence, as though money and engineering had joined hands and become architecture. And yet the first truth of Biltmore is this: grandeur is only the visible half. Walk through the public rooms and you see the performance of permanence, marble underfoot, stained glass softening the winter light, oak paneling cut and carved with ambition, a glass-roofed conservatory bright against the season, vast walls hung with art, surfaces polished to a glow, rooms arranged to suggest not comfort but command. The house does not merely welcome you, it informs you that you have entered a world built to outlast ordinary life. But behind that performance lies an organism. Below the reception rooms, Biltmore runs on heat, labor, timing, and fuel. In the lower levels, furnaces burn through coal with the appetite of a factory. Pipes carry warmth through the bones of the house. Service corridors stretch in plain lines behind the decorative walls. Narrow staircases conceal the movement of staff. Pantries, laundries, storage rooms, kitchens, workshops, all of it arranged with military logic, so that elegance upstairs can appear effortless. Effortless is the one thing it is not. To keep a place like this alive requires an army of people working out of sight. Maids, valets, cooks, laundresses, gardeners, drivers, stablemen, engineers, plumbers, groundskeepers, foresters. Fires must be built before dawn. Water must run hot on command. Meals must arrive when expected. Linen must return clean. Silver must return bright. Lamps and systems must be monitored before failure becomes catastrophe. Remove enough hands from the machine and the illusion collapses. So does the balance sheet. A house of this magnitude consumes everything. Coal by the ton, food in relentless volume, wages every week, repairs without end, slate shifts, pipes burst, plaster opens in hairline fractures, boilers demand inspection, equipment wears down, weather presses on stone and roof and window frame. The larger the dream, the more merciless the upkeep. Beauty in places like this is not a finished achievement, it is a recurring expense. That is what makes Biltmore so compelling. It is not merely a masterpiece of Gilded Age ambition. It is a masterpiece with a pulse, and anything with a pulse can weaken. In the glow of Christmas 1895, however, the weakness is easy to miss. The house is dressed for triumph. Evergreen garlands cut across carved stone. Candlelight and electric light mingle. Guests arrive by train, then by carriage, climbing through the mountain landscape toward a residence designed to astonish them. Music travels through the rooms. Glass reflects flame. For a few luminous days, the entire project appears complete. This is how dynastic dreams survive in public memory. What memory usually omits is the cost beneath the image. Taxes, payroll, fuel, deferred maintenance, economic collapse, inheritance, hard decisions made in private by people forced to choose between sentiment and survival. Houses like Biltmore do not endure because they are beautiful. They endure because someone agrees to change what they are. A private sanctuary becomes a public institution. Family space becomes tourist route. Intimacy gives way to preservation. Silence gives way to ticket sales. That transformation is part of Biltmore's story too, and so is the uncomfortable question at its center. Who truly paid for a place like this? The heir who imagined it? The workers who built it? The staff who kept it breathing? The widow who made the cuts that saved it? Or the millions of strangers who would one day pass through its rooms, funding its survival, one admission at a time? On that first Christmas, none of those questions had fully surfaced. Not yet. The house glowed against the mountain, dark, radiant, and self-assured, a monument to wealth disciplined into form. But beneath the music and candlelight, another reality had already taken shape. Biltmore was not simply a home, it was a system. A splendid, hungry, expensive system. And systems like that do not ask whether they are beautiful. They ask whether they can last. To understand Biltmore, you have to begin with the man who wanted it, because the house makes little sense until its maker does. George Washington, Vanderbilt II, was born in 1862 into a family so rich it had already begun to distort the American imagination. His grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, had turned steamships and railroads into an empire. By the late 19th century, the Vanderbilt name no longer suggested prosperity. It signaled scale, reach, control, the ability to bend geography, industry, and society toward private will. George inherited the money, but not the family temperament. His brothers moved through the Gilded Age the way the era expected rich men to move, publicly, competitively, with houses in Newport, dinners, guests, spectacle, display. George turned inward. He was reserved, educated, awkward in social performance, and far more interested in books than in approval. He read voraciously, collected seriously, traveled constantly, and seemed drawn less to fashionable life than to the systems beneath culture, architecture, landscape, language, cultivation, order. Wealth gave him access to the world. Solitude gave him the patience to study it. Biltmore was never conceived as a glittering stage set for society. George imagined something quieter and stranger, a private domain large enough to contain thought, a house for reading, a refuge for disciplined beauty, an estate where land, architecture, agriculture, and forestry might function together as one coherent idea. Not simply luxury, but control. Not merely comfort, but form imposed on scale. In 1888, he traveled to Asheville, North Carolina, with his mother. The region was still relatively remote by elite standards, though increasingly reachable by rail. That balance mattered. It offered mountain air, dramatic scenery, and separation from the social circuits of the Northeast. Asheville was accessible without feeling exposed, cultivated enough for a man of means, wild enough to suggest possibility. He began acquiring land in tracts so large they stopped sounding domestic and started sounding territorial. Farms, wooded slopes, depleted fields, cut-over hillsides, acres exhausted by bad farming and careless extraction. Over time, those purchases expanded into a holding of astonishing scale, vast enough to feel less like an estate than a private jurisdiction. What attracted him was not only the view, but the opportunity to shape the land itself, to restore it, organize it, and bind it to a larger vision. The house at the center of that vision would have to perform two tasks at once. It had to carry the cultural authority of Europe while embracing the technical confidence of modern America. George wanted grandeur, certainly, but not emptiness. The residence had to hold a serious library, a serious art collection, and a serious life. It had to function year-round. It had to be livable, serviceable, and supported by a surrounding property capable of producing food, timber, and order. It was an aristocratic fantasy with an engineer's logic. George could afford to think on that scale because the Vanderbilt fortune, carefully invested, generated enormous income. In the late 1880s, it was still possible to believe that capital of that size could sustain both creation and upkeep indefinitely. That assumption would later prove fragile. At the beginning, it felt rational. He believed he was building correctly. Even so, desire was not enough. To convert imagination into stone, roads, gardens, and systems, George needed people whose talent matched his ambition. He found them in two men who would define the project as powerfully as he did. The first was Richard Morris Hunt, the country's most formidable architect, educated in Paris and fluent in the language of European grandeur. Hunt understood how to give new money the dignity of old form. He knew proportion, ceremony, silhouette, and the psychological force of arrival. He could design a residence that looked inherited, even when it was new. The second was Frederick Law Olmsted, already legendary for reshaping the American landscape. Olmsted did not treat land as decoration. He treated it as a living structure. Terrain, drainage, planting, movement, and view had to work together, or nothing truly worked at all. He brought not prettiness, but philosophy. With George, Hunt, and Olmsted in alignment, Biltmore ceased to be a rich man's idea. It became a project with authorship, discipline, and destiny. Then came the hard part, turning intention into matter. A dream on paper is elegant. A dream on a mountain is an operation. What George Vanderbilt wanted in western North Carolina was not a country house assembled by routine contractors and polite schedules. It was a private world raised on a remote ridge, supplied from afar, engineered at scale, and executed with a level of control more often associated with military campaigns than domestic architecture. Nearly everything required for it had to be invented, organized, transported, or built into existence. Richard Morris Hunt understood that immediately. The site above the French Broad River offered drama, but drama is not the same thing as readiness. The land was elevated, beautiful, and isolated. Local suppliers could not furnish the volume or refinement the project demanded. The surrounding region had neither the specialized workshops nor the distribution network needed for carved stone, ornamental plaster, fine metalwork, custom glazing, or the endless stream of finished components a house of this ambition required. Even moving heavy materials up to the plateau posed a problem. Distance was one obstacle, terrain was another. Hunt answered with discipline. He conceived the house in the language of the French chateau, not as imitation but as translation. The design carried the authority of old Europe while being calculated for modern use. The exterior relied on balance, but never stiffness. Towers fixed the composition. Roof lines broke the sky with deliberate variety. The arrival sequence was staged so that the building revealed itself as an event rather than a structure. Inside, the plan moved from grandeur to privacy with great precision. Public rooms announced status. Upper rooms withdrew into family life. Ornament was never merely decorative. It directed the eye, reinforced hierarchy, framed movement, and gave the entire building a sense of inevitability. Just as important, Hunt designed for construction, not fantasy. Materials were chosen with a cold understanding of time. Limestone for the exterior, durable enough to endure weather and expressive enough to reward fine carving. Oak for floors, paneling, and structural richness. Marble where permanence needed visual weight. Copper overhead, expensive at the outset but wise across generations. Drawings were exacting. Measurements were checked and rechecked. Components were identified with meticulous clarity. On a project this large, an error would not remain local. It would multiply. Precision was not refinement. It was protection. If Hunt's challenge was architectural, Frederick Law Olmsted's was ecological. His first reading of the land was sobering. The property George had assembled was immense, but much of it had been abused. Years of careless logging and extractive farming had stripped hillsides, weakened soils, muddied streams, and left broad sections of the landscape exhausted. The damage was not only scenic, it was structural. Water moved badly. Slopes eroded. Productive ground had been diminished by use without stewardship. What surrounded the future house was not an estate in waiting. It was a wounded terrain. Olmsted refused the obvious temptation. He did not propose to decorate the ruin and disguise it as refinement. He proposed repair. His landscape plan was expansive, patient, and unusually serious. Reforestation would restore the mountain setting over time. Roads would be shaped not simply for access, but for emotional sequence, leading visitors through controlled views and gradual revelation. Near the house, formal gardens would impose geometry, color, and cultivated calm. Farther out, managed woodland would demonstrate that utility and beauty need not oppose each other. In Olmsted's hands, the estate was not a backdrop. It was a living system being brought back under order. But systems require infrastructure, and infrastructure requires money. George authorized both. A private rail spur connected the project to the outside world. On-site facilities multiplied. A brick plant to produce material in the millions, a woodworking operation to mill and shape timber, a stone yard to cut and finish masonry, temporary housing for laborers, storage for tools and supplies, roads for internal movement, yards for staging. At its peak, the workforce climbed past 1,000 men. The project drew craftsmen from different places and traditions. Italian stonemasons brought old-world skill. Regional carpenters understood mountain hardwoods. Plasterers, painters, brickmakers, glaziers, blacksmiths, metalworkers, and laborers folded into the enterprise. For Western North Carolina, the scale was astonishing. So were the logistics. Stone traveled by rail from Indiana, then by wagon up the mountain. Massive timbers had to be hauled across difficult grades. Copper arrived in carefully managed shipments. Glass, hardware, fixtures, tools, fasteners, fuel, and finish materials had to be ordered, tracked, received, and installed without confusion. Nothing about the process was casual. Everything moved according to plan, or risked delay, waste, or failure. Hunt and Olmsted were building on different clocks. The house could rise within years. The forest would require decades. Yet both understood the same thing. Biltmore was being made to outlive its makers. The quieter question was whether even immense wealth could keep pace with an ambition that large for long. Construction began in 1890, and from the start it was clear that Biltmore would not be built so much as forced into existence. For 5 years, the mountain became a site of extraction, calculation, discipline, and exhaustion. What emerged by Christmas of 1895 looked effortless to guests. What made it possible was anything but. Before walls could rise, the ridge had to be broken open. The chosen ground commanded magnificent views over the valley, but it was uneven, resistant, and unprepared for a structure of such size. Crews cut deep into the earth to create the substructure that would carry the estate's hidden machinery. This was not just a basement. It was the stomach and lungs of the house, space for heat, fuel, storage, circulation, and service. Soil was removed by brute labor, cart by cart, shovel by shovel, the mountain gradually made to accept geometry. Then, stone began to arrive. Limestone came in by rail from the Midwest, each shipment tied to architectural drawings that left little room for improvisation. Many pieces were already shaped before reaching North Carolina. Carved surrounds, molded details, ornamental fragments meant to lock into a larger composition. On the hill, masons placed them in sequence with accuracy. Mortar was mixed on site. Lines had to remain true. Weight had to transfer cleanly. In dry weather, the walls rose steadily. In rain, fog, or bitter cold, the work slowed, but it did not lose its rigor. The point was never speed. The point was endurance. As the shell climbed upward, the interior became a second campaign. Biltmore was designed to appear ancestral, but it was being outfitted with technologies that belonged to the modern age. Electrical wiring had to be installed before the finished surfaces closed around it. Because domestic electrification was still new, the system required custom planning, including remote generation to reduce the danger of fire. Light would come at a switch. Bedrooms would signal servants with push buttons. A medieval fantasy was being laced with industrial nerves. Heating demanded even more. A residence of this scale could not rely on scattered fireplaces alone, however numerous they were. It needed a centralized thermal system powerful enough to move warmth through an enormous volume of rooms and corridors. That meant large boilers below, miles of pipe, radiators throughout, and constant oversight. Heat, in Biltmore, was not a luxury one bought once. It was a permanent obligation. Fuel had to keep arriving. Pressure had to remain stable. Equipment had to be watched. Even comfort had an operating cost. That may have been George Vanderbilt's most lasting contribution. The mansion impressed visitors. The forest changed minds. One was a symbol of wealth. The other was a model of continuity. Yet both were expensive. Both required oversight. And both depended on the same underlying fact. Vision, no matter how intelligent, still needed money behind it. The bills did not pause just because the house was beautiful. By Christmas of 1895, Biltmore was ready to perform the role it had been built to play. Snow lay over the Blue Ridge. Firelight burned in the grates. Electric lamps softened the interiors with a modern glow that felt miraculous. Beneath glass, the winter garden carried green life through the season. Tables were set. Music traveled through the rooms. After years of planning and labor, George Vanderbilt could finally watch the house do what he had imagined it would do: receive people and alter them. Arrival was part of the design. Guests came first by rail, then by carriage, drawn upward along a road meant to withhold the full spectacle until the proper moment. Trees framed glimpses, curves delayed comprehension. And then the facade appeared at once, immense and composed, less like a residence than an announcement. Inside, the effect intensified. The entrance hall rose in stone and carved wood across multiple stories. Light moved through stained glass. Floors shone. Everything communicated deliberation, scale, and self-command. George himself remained understated. He was not interested in social theatre. His hospitality was quieter, more selective. Visitors were led not only toward grandeur, but toward evidence of cultivation. The library, dense with books and gravity. The winter garden, improbable in winter. The banquet hall, monumental without being reckless. If the house impressed, it did so by suggesting total environment rather than luxury. What astonished many guests, however, was not just the architecture. It was the ease. Lights appeared instantly. Elevators moved discreetly between floors. Baths offered hot water on demand. Rooms of extraordinary scale felt temperate in winter. Service appeared before it was requested. The residents gave the impression that comfort, beauty, and order could be made permanent if one possessed enough money. That impression depended on an invisible population. To keep Biltmore functioning required a large staff in constant motion. Housemaids preserved surfaces that would otherwise dull under use. Footmen carried trays, answered bells, managed fires, and moved between public grace and backstage labor. Cooks fed both family and staff. Laundresses handled a daily flood of fabric. Engineers watched the heating plant and the hidden mechanics that made the house feel smooth. Gardeners held the grounds in shape. Stablemen managed horses and vehicles. Foresters watched the larger estate. Each role carried a cost. Each department drew resources. Nothing about the operation was passive. Fuel arrived in heavy quantities. Food came from both purchase and production. Repairs were continuous because a building this ambitious is never truly finished. Rooflines shifted under weather. Plaster cracked. Pipes failed. Fixtures aged. Systems required inspection. Maintenance was not an occasional burden. It was the permanent condition of ownership. George understood that. He was not careless with money, nor blind to arithmetic. His fortune was immense, supported by investments broad enough to seem unshakable. But Biltmore was expensive in a way even enormous wealth had to respect. He kept detailed accounts: salaries, coal, provisions, insurance, upkeep, taxes. All of it moved through ledgers with the cold clarity of fact. Farms, dairies, gardens, orchards, and managed woodland supplied food, goods, and some income. They reduced pressure. They did not eliminate it. So George responded with restraint. He kept entertaining controlled. He avoided unnecessary spectacle. He invested in systems that might make the property more efficient over time. The hope was not extravagance without limit. It was balance. If the land grew more productive and the house was run with discipline, perhaps the estate could support itself. For a while, that hope seemed justified. The house operated, the forest improved. Biltmore Village developed into an orderly community with cottages, shops, a church, and a school. Wages were respectable by the standards of the period. Housing was comparatively sound. The whole enterprise projected stability. That was the seductive part. From a distance, Biltmore looked secure, as though scale itself guaranteed permanence. But every month still ended the same way, with bills, with transfers, with the recognition that magnificence was only sustainable so long as money kept arriving faster than the house could consume it. For a time, George managed that equation. Then history intervened, and the numbers began to change. After that first Christmas, Biltmore settled into something more dangerous than spectacle: routine. George Vanderbilt had never intended the estate to exist as a decorative fantasy, admired from a distance and financed without limit. He wanted it to function. Beauty mattered, but utility mattered too. The house would stand at the center of a working domain, one in which farms, dairies, gardens, woodlands, workshops, and labor all contributed to the same idea. Biltmore was supposed to be magnificent, yes, but also productive enough to soften the financial burden of its own existence. The agricultural side expanded with quiet seriousness. The dairy operation became one of the strongest in the region, with Jersey cattle grazing low pastures and milk handled with a degree of cleanliness still unusual in much of the rural South. Butter and cheese generated dependable income. Kitchen gardens and glasshouses supplied produce through the seasons. Orchards yielded fruit. Livestock provided meat, eggs, and practical stability. The goal was not rustic romance. It was controlled supply, reduced dependence, and insulation from unstable markets. In the woods, the larger experiment continued under professional supervision. Managed cutting brought in modest revenue, but the deeper achievement was restorative. Ground cover returned. Washed-out slopes began to hold. Young stands established themselves where damage had once seemed permanent. The forest no longer looked like a residue of extraction. It began to look like a system under care. That distinction mattered to George. He wanted proof that land, if governed with patience and intelligence, could recover from abuse and remain useful without being ruined again. Near the entrance, Biltmore Village gave the estate a social form to match its economic one. Designed with studied charm rather than grandeur, it housed workers and services in buildings that suggested order, modest comfort, and permanence. There were shops, cottages, a church, a school, and medical care. George's labour policies were paternalistic, but they were also unusually stable for the time. Wages came on schedule. Housing was maintained. Workers' children could be educated. The result was a community that compared favourably with many industrial settlements elsewhere in the South, where exploitation was harsher and standards far lower. Inside the house, life remained deliberately restrained. George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898, and she suited the place precisely because she did not mistake grandeur for noise. Together they preferred intimacy over display. Entertaining at Biltmore was selective. Dinners, small gatherings, guests for the weekend, music in winter, not endless performance for society columns. This reflected temperament, but also arithmetic. Every unnecessary flourish had a cost. More guests meant more food, more fuel, more labor, more wear. George did not need spectacle to prove wealth. He needed solvency. Running Biltmore required a discipline closer to administration than domesticity. Staff moved in shifts. Fires were maintained, meals coordinated, rooms turned, linens managed, silver polished, schedules kept. A domestic hierarchy oversaw standards room by room, floor by floor. Beyond the house, shops repaired tools, tack, and woodwork. Deliveries arrived by rail. Carriages moved, and later motorcars appeared, reflecting George's interest in modern systems. The estate operated like a contained municipality with a private treasury behind it. For a time, the model held. Investment income covered what production could not. Farms, forestry, and estate enterprises reduced pressure without eliminating it. Hundreds of people depended on the property for wages, and the estate's presence rippled outward through Asheville and the surrounding region. Biltmore began to look successful, as though George had solved the central problem of great houses by making this one useful enough to survive itself. But the equilibrium was thinner than it appeared. Cash had to keep moving. The house could not be paused. Staff could not simply vanish without consequences. Systems could not be neglected without inviting larger, more expensive failures later. There was little that could be cut safely without weakening the entire design. George watched expenses closely, searched for efficiencies, and resisted waste wherever he found it. He believed time would improve the numbers, that productivity would continue rising while costs became more manageable. What he could not see was that the next threats would not come from mismanagement inside the gates, but from forces beyond them. The first true threat did not come from a cracked wall or a failed harvest. It came from Washington. By the early 1910s, Biltmore had achieved something that once seemed improbable: operational rhythm. The house had been running long enough for its routines to harden into habit. Staff understood their places in the machinery. The farms were productive. The managed woodlands were beginning to return income while visibly healing from earlier abuse. George and Edith were raising their daughter Cornelia, and the family's life, though privileged, remained comparatively restrained. Winters were spent at Biltmore. Other seasons unfolded elsewhere. From the outside, the estate appeared secure, almost settled into permanence. That appearance depended on a financial arrangement the age had long taken for granted. Then the rules changed. In 1913, the federal income tax altered the economics of private wealth in the United States. Fortunes that had previously flowed with limited direct interference from Washington now faced a new and continuing claim. For men like George Vanderbilt, whose investment income supported not only comfort but a highly complex property, the shift was not abstract. It entered the ledgers immediately. Money that had once gone toward payroll, fuel, repairs, and operations now left for the federal government. The estate's internal arithmetic, already delicate beneath its outward calm, tightened at once. Biltmore's expenses did not become smaller simply because the country had changed. The boilers still needed coal. The roofs still needed watching. Staff still had to be paid. The house remained what it had always been: beautiful, demanding, and expensive, in ways that did not pause for policy. George began to make adjustments. Travel was reduced. Purchases were deferred. Some maintenance could wait, though not forever. Vacancies were handled carefully rather than filled automatically. He did not panic. He trimmed. He recalculated. He believed the estate could adapt to the new reality if managed with discipline. It was a reasonable belief. It also required time. Time failed him. In March of 1914, George traveled to Washington for medical care after ongoing health troubles worsened. What mattered was the speed. His condition deteriorated. Surgery followed. On March 6th, George Washington Vanderbilt II died in Washington at the age of 51. The news moved back to North Carolina by telegram, concise in form, catastrophic in consequence. His death was not merely a family tragedy, it was an institutional shock. George had been quiet by temperament, but Biltmore bore his mind everywhere. The house, the estate economy, the forestry experiment, the village, the employment structure, the entire philosophy of the place had been shaped by his sensibility and financed by his resources. Remove him, and what remained was not just grief, it was exposure. For Edith, widowhood arrived with numbers. George's will left the estate to her for life, with their daughter as the next heir. That inheritance included everything the property represented: the house, the land, the systems, the prestige, the obligations, the payroll, the unresolved imbalance between what the estate produced and what it consumed. When Edith sat down with the books, the picture was unambiguous. Revenue from farming and timber helped, but not enough. The property still relied on investment income to bridge the difference, and now that income was diminished by new federal taxation and the costs associated with settling George's estate, the conclusion was not emotional. It was mathematical. Biltmore, as then operated, cost more than it generated. Without decisive change, capital would slowly be drained to preserve appearances, and appearances would eventually fail anyway. Edith understood the alternatives with unusual clarity. She could try to preserve the estate exactly as her husband had conceived it, protecting memory while sacrificing the future. Or she could begin cutting into the dream in order to save what was essential. She was 43, newly widowed, responsible for a teenage daughter, and for a vast enterprise that sustained hundreds of lives. The burden was immense. So was the scrutiny that would follow any decision she made. What mattered is that she did not hesitate for long. Edith Vanderbilt understood something sentiment rarely admits. Legacy survives only when someone is willing to injure the fantasy in order to preserve the core. She began to plan. Edith Vanderbilt understood a fact that destroys many grand houses. Devotion is not a financial strategy. She cared deeply for Biltmore. It had been her husband's great work, the place where his taste, intellect, discipline, and ambition had taken physical form. She had helped transform it from an architectural achievement into a family life. But affection could not heat thousands of rooms, pay wages, maintain roofs, or prevent the slow violence of unpaid obligations. The estate was losing money, and it was losing it with the quiet consistency that ruins dynasties long before scandal ever does. So Edith began where serious people begin, with the numbers. She brought in accountants and attorneys to examine the estate without nostalgia. Their conclusions were severe. Annual expenses were enormous. Revenue from the productive parts of the property, farming, dairy operations, timber, covered only a fraction of what the whole enterprise required. The rest still depended on investment income already weakened by new taxation, estate settlement costs, and the basic reality that Biltmore had been designed for abundance, not austerity. If operations continued unchanged, the reserve would not last. A decade, perhaps less, and the family would face the kind of humiliation great houses fear most: liquidation under pressure. There were advisors who recommended the obvious solution: sell, leave, convert beauty into cash, and preserve comfort elsewhere. Edith refused. Not because she was naive, but because she understood precisely what would be lost. Biltmore was more than a widow's attachment. It was one of the most important private houses ever built in America. It supported workers, families, trades, and an entire local economy. It held collections, interiors, craftsmanship, and systems that could not be replicated once broken apart. If the estate was to survive, the answer would not be surrender. It would be surgery. She divided the problem. The mansion, its immediate grounds, and the village formed the irreplaceable centre. That was the part worth defending at almost any cost. The outer acreage, however historically significant, belonged to a different category. Valuable? Yes. Essential? No. If Biltmore was going to live, the estate would have to become smaller. That decision required a kind of ruthlessness that often gets mistaken for coldness. In fact, it was stewardship. In 1915, Edith entered negotiations with the federal government over the sale of a vast portion of the surrounding woodland. The timing was significant. The United States was beginning to think more seriously about conservation and national forests, and the Biltmore Tract, already known for its careful management, represented exactly the kind of land public agencies wanted: contiguous, substantial, and already shaped by scientific forestry rather than waste. What George had assembled for private experiment was now valuable as public resource. The sale was not immediate. Boundaries had to be established, parcels surveyed, values argued over, lawyers drafted and redrafted. Public money required public process, and public process moves slowly even when the need is obvious. But in 1916, the transaction closed. Tens of thousands of acres passed out of private Vanderbilt ownership and into federal hands, land that would become part of Pisgah National Forest. Then came the woodwork, where extravagance became labor at its most intimate. Oak was shaped into paneling, floors, staircases, doors, mantels, and ceilings with a level of finish meant to suggest inheritance rather than manufacture. The library alone consumed months of concentrated craftsmanship, its surfaces built not simply to house books, but to give scholarship a theatrical setting. Elsewhere, bedrooms received fitted cabinetry and custom trim. Bathrooms, unusually numerous for the period, were finished with tile, porcelain, and reliable hot and cold water. Every refined surface depended on hours no visitor would ever be asked to imagine. The labor behind it was relentless. Dust settled in lungs. Winter hardened the sight. Heights injured the careless and punished the unlucky. Men worked long days, 6 days a week, under conditions that rewarded skill and tolerated very little weakness. Craftsmen earned more than common laborers, but no one on the hill was being paid for ease. Women, too, were part of the machinery of construction, feeding crews, laundering work clothes, sustaining the temporary settlement that formed around the job. For several years, the estate was less a home in the making than a company town under pressure. By 1894, the outline had stabilized. Roof lines were in place. Copper sealed the structure overhead. Inside, finish work intensified. Walls were closed, trim painted, pipes tested, wiring checked, surfaces laid, furnishings selected, art placed, books shelved. The deadline was fixed, and the house had to be ready to receive Christmas. It was. But even as the last rooms approached completion, another, slower undertaking was only beginning. The house could be finished in years. The land surrounding it would require something rarer: time. The house was complete. The land was not. That first season at Biltmore, George Vanderbilt could stand inside a finished library, surrounded by thousands of chosen volumes, and still look outward at a world that felt unresolved. Near the house, the illusion held. The approach had been shaped with intelligence. The gardens near the residence offered order, rhythm, and cultivated restraint. Roads curved with intention. Views arrived in sequence. Close to the mansion, the estate suggested harmony. Farther out, it told the truth. Much of the surrounding property had been used hard and left damaged. Hillsides had been stripped by careless cutting. Valuable timber had been taken quickly, with little concern for what remained. Fields carved into steep slopes had been pushed into short-term cultivation, then deserted once the soil failed. Rains tore through weakened ground and carried it downhill. Streams clouded with sediment after storms. Forest cover had thinned, fragmented, and in places disappeared entirely. The land still possessed grandeur, but it had also been exhausted by appetite. George saw more than scenery. He saw a test. He did not want the estate merely to frame the house. He wanted it to function, to recover, and eventually to produce. If managed intelligently, woodland could do more than look picturesque from a terrace. It could generate timber, stabilize soil, improve water, and help support the costs of the estate itself. That idea was unusual in America at the time. Wealthy landowners often collected acreage as atmosphere. George wanted a system. The ambition was aesthetic, but it was also economic and scientific. The problem was that the country had almost no profession equipped to carry it out. Europe had long traditions of managed forestry, especially in Germany, where woodland was studied, measured, and harvested according to plans meant to preserve yield. The United States, by contrast, had built fortunes by cutting and moving on. Extraction was familiar. Stewardship was not. To create the kind of forest he imagined, George needed expertise that barely existed on American soil. Frederick Law Olmsted pointed him toward a young man who represented something new. Gifford Pinchot had recently returned from Europe, where he had studied scientific forest management seriously. He was young, ambitious, intellectually restless, and exactly suited to a property large enough to serve as both challenge and experiment. When he entered George's orbit, he encountered two things at once: a damaged landscape and an extraordinary opportunity. Pinchot began not with slogans, but with inventory. He needed to know what was actually there: species, density, regeneration, damage, slope, water movement, risk. Men moved through tract after tract, observing, marking, recording. From those observations came decisions. Instead of stripping hillsides clean, mature trees could be removed selectively while younger growth remained in place. That preserved cover, protected the soil, and allowed future harvests to exist at all. Fire risk could be managed with breaks and controlled intervention. Worn-out sections could be replanted. Access roads and working trails could be cut with purpose rather than improvised by damage. This was not romantic conservation. It was disciplined land management. Local crews planted seedlings, thinned growth, controlled burn conditions where needed, and began restoring sections that had been treated as expendable. Species were chosen not only for beauty, but for fitness, durability, and value. The estate woods became a proving ground where theory had to answer to terrain, weather, labor, and time. Records were kept. Methods were tested. Results were studied. In that sense, Biltmore's forest was as modern as its electric lights. Pinchot did not remain long. His work at Biltmore helped establish the intellectual foundation of American forestry at the national level. But the experiment did not end when he left. It deepened. He was succeeded by Carl Schenk, a German-trained forester with rigor, field sense, and a belief that forest management should be taught through practice, not abstraction. Under Schenk, the estate became not only a managed landscape, but a school. Students learned by working the woods, marking trees, estimating yield, reading soils, planning roads, understanding fire, diagnosing disease, and seeing the difference between exploitation and stewardship in real time. What happened there would influence forestry across the country. For Edith, the meaning was double. The transaction generated cash, reduced pressure, and created the reserve she needed to stabilize what remained. But it also allowed George's forestry ideals to survive in altered form. The land would no longer belong to the family, but it would continue under principles he had helped advance. Biltmore became smaller. Its larger intellectual legacy remained intact. Once the outer land was gone, Edith turned inward. The estate had to be resized to match its means. Staff levels fell gradually, not through theatrical purges, but through attrition, selective dismissals, and consolidation. Where possible, she softened the damage with references and severance. Departments were streamlined. Rooms no longer necessary to daily life were closed off. Heating was concentrated where it mattered most. Decorative gardening was simplified. Maintenance became triage. Systems first, appearances second. Coal was saved where it could be. Labor was allocated with discipline. Her own social spending narrowed sharply. Entertaining diminished. Travel contracted. Every dollar needed a reason. This was not restoration. It was controlled survival. Edith managed the estate with a temperament closer to an executive than a hostess. She reviewed accounts, challenged costs, and abandoned any lingering fantasy that Biltmore could return to the fullness of George's original model. That world was gone. What remained possible was a leaner version of continuity, a property modest enough in operation to endure, yet grand enough in substance to remain worth saving. And for a time, the strategy worked. Through the 1920s, the house held. Bills were paid. The core estate remained intact. Cornelia grew older, married, and began building a life of her own. Biltmore no longer represented limitless confidence, but it had escaped collapse. Edith had done something few inheritors of monumental wealth managed to do. She had accepted reduction without allowing ruin. Then the wider American economy began to fail and the next crisis arrived. The collapse arrived in the autumn of 1929, and with it came the kind of clarity wealth never wants. Markets broke, banks folded, credit contracted, businesses failed. Across the country, what had looked like stability through the previous decade revealed itself as something thinner, more speculative, and far less durable than people had imagined. Even great fortunes, layered across industries and investments, shrank with alarming speed. Biltmore was still attached to the same economy. When the broader system faltered, the estate felt it immediately. The income Edith Vanderbilt depended upon began to weaken. Investments that had once produced reliable support no longer offered certainty. Dividends declined. Some vanished altogether. The money that paid wages, bought fuel, ordered supplies, and kept repairs moving became harder to predict from month to month. At the same time, the region around Asheville was suffering its own collapse. Tourism, which had grown steadily with the rise of the automobile and mountain travel, dried up with brutal speed. Vacations became an indulgence most families could no longer justify. Hotels emptied, shops struggled, restaurants closed. Western North Carolina, like much of the nation, entered a season of hardship. Edith read the numbers and saw the trap. Biltmore had already been reduced, disciplined, and streamlined. There was still room to cut, but not much room to cut safely. More staff could be dismissed, more rooms could be closed, more maintenance could be deferred. Yet every historic structure has a point below which economy becomes damaged. Water enters where care recedes. Stone holds, but plaster loosens, wood swells, systems fail, and neglected problems harden into expensive emergencies. A great house can survive austerity for a while. It cannot survive indifference. Selling was considered, as it always is when a private fortune begins to buckle under a public symbol. But the logic was weak. The land could be divided, perhaps, though even that was uncertain in a ruined market. The house itself was another matter. It was too large, too specialized, too costly, too bound to its original purpose. Biltmore had been built as a private estate for a particular kind of life. There were few buyers in America capable of taking on such a burden, and fewer willing to do so in the middle of economic collapse. Then came the idea that would have seemed unthinkable only a generation earlier. Open the house to the public. For Edith's world, privacy was not merely preference, it was class structure. The notion of strangers moving through rooms that had belonged to family life, pausing before furniture, pictures, fireplaces, and staircases would once have carried the odor of humiliation. But the logic was harder to dismiss than the discomfort. If Biltmore could attract visitors, it might generate revenue. More than that, it might send money into Asheville at a moment when the region desperately needed it. Travelers would need meals, fuel, lodging, and services. The estate itself would need attendants, guides, cashiers, and grounds crews. A house built on private wealth might, in altered form, become an engine of local survival. Edith chose adaptation over pride. In the spring of 1930, Biltmore opened its doors for paid admission. The preparations were practical rather than theatrical. Paths were organized. Barriers protected interiors. Staff were trained to direct movement and answer questions. Public rooms were selected carefully. Private spaces remained private. Notices appeared in newspapers. Tickets were priced to matter, but not so high as to repel curiosity in a hard season. What had once been a controlled domestic environment was reimagined as an experience. There was no guarantee the public would come. They did. Visitors arrived from Asheville and the surrounding countryside, some by automobile, some by wagon, some on foot. They entered not just out of curiosity, but out of need, wonder, memory, and perhaps something harder to name. In a period defined by failure, Biltmore still offered scale, craftsmanship, order, and the reassurance that beauty had not entirely disappeared from American life. The income it generated was not transformative at first, but the principle was. The house had found its second life. It would no longer survive as a private refuge. It would endure as a place the public was invited to enter. The 1930s moved through Biltmore without drama, but not without strain. Visitors came, then thinned, then returned in modest waves as the economy shifted beneath them. Admission receipts kept the estate alive, though never comfortably. This was not prosperity, it was maintenance by vigilance. Edith Vanderbilt weighed every repair against every ticket sold, knowing the margin was narrow, and that one weak season could reopen the question she had spent years postponing. How long can a great house survive on adaptation alone? Then history intervened again. In December 1941, the United States entered the Second World War, and almost overnight the fragile tourism model collapsed. Gasoline was rationed. Rubber was restricted. Civilian travel narrowed under wartime priorities. Young men left for service. Families stopped thinking about excursions and began thinking about scarcity, enlistment, and endurance. The visitors who had sustained Biltmore through the Depression disappeared into the larger emergency of the nation. Edith faced another edge, familiar by then, though no less dangerous for being familiar. This time, the answer arrived from outside the world of estates altogether. The National Gallery of Art in Washington had a problem few private houses could solve. Its collection contained works of enormous cultural value, objects too important to leave vulnerable in the capital during wartime. The fear was not theatrical. In an age of global bombing, sabotage, and uncertainty, even institutions in Washington had to think defensively. The gallery needed a place inland, secluded, structurally sound, climatically stable, and large enough to hold major works in storage for an indefinite period. Security had to be controllable. Access had to be limited. The building had to protect beauty from catastrophe. Biltmore answered every requirement almost by accident. It sat deep in the mountains, well removed from ports and strategic coastlines. The house was made largely of stone and built on a scale that allowed entire rooms to be repurposed without disorder. Its interiors, designed decades earlier for comfort and control, could maintain temperatures suitable for fragile objects. The estate was private, gated, and reached by a manageable network of roads. It was remote enough to disappear, substantial enough to protect, and sophisticated enough to serve. Arrangements were made quietly. In 1942, Shipments began arriving under restraint and without ceremony. Trucks came in after dark. Crates marked with numbers rather than names were unloaded discreetly and brought inside through service entrances. Guards accompanied them. Rooms that had once held music, guests, or domestic calm were transformed into controlled storage. Few people on the estate knew exactly what had been entrusted to the house, only that the contents were of exceptional significance. Inside those crates were paintings and cultural treasures whose value far exceeded money, works that belonged not merely to collectors or institutions, but to the symbolic inheritance of the country itself. The image is almost unnervingly precise. Beyond the mountains, war. Inside Biltmore, silence, stone, and packed masterpieces waiting in the dark. The arrangement continued through the war years. Security remained discreet. Representatives inspected conditions. Temperatures were monitored. The estate, once forced to reinvent itself as a public attraction, now entered another role entirely. It became a vault. The winter garden still existed. The library still held its gravity. But the house moved in a different register now. Fewer footsteps. Less social noise. Guards making rounds. Crates stacked where conversation once drifted. A mansion built to display privilege had become a shelter for civilization. For Edith, the practical advantages were real. The government paid for the use of the space, providing steady, if limited, income, while tourism had vanished. Federal security reduced pressure on the estate itself. But the larger significance ran deeper. Biltmore was no longer simply surviving because the public found it beautiful. It had proven useful under national emergency. That distinction changed everything. When peace returned and the stored works were removed, the house emerged from the war with a different moral weight. It had not merely endured, it had served. And once a place like Biltmore proves it can serve something larger than the family that built it, its future stops belonging to sentiment alone. That realization would shape every serious decision about its future from that moment forward, permanently. The years after the war did not bring ease so much as a new kind of pressure. Edith Vanderbilt had carried Biltmore through financial strain, public opening, and wartime reinvention. But by the late 1940s and early 1950s, time itself had become part of the problem. Tourism recovered as Americans returned to the road and the middle class expanded, but admission receipts alone could not solve the deeper issue. Biltmore remained enormous, costly, and mechanically demanding. The question was no longer whether it could survive another season. It was whether it could survive another generation. That question sharpened as family circumstances changed. Cornelia's life had moved away from the estate, and responsibility would increasingly pass to the next generation. What they inherited was not simply a beautiful property. It was a burden disguised as legacy, a landmark scale house, a historic landscape, and a business model fragile enough that one severe disruption could reopen the old danger of decline. Recognition came, but recognition brought weight. When Biltmore received formal historic status in the 1960s, the designation confirmed what had long been obvious. This was not merely a private family possession. It was one of the major architectural survivals of the American Gilded Age. With that distinction came a harder truth. A place of this stature could not simply be left to age into graceful ruin. William Cecil understood that clearly. Under his leadership, Biltmore began a transition from inherited estate to professionally managed institution. The house could no longer operate as a private residence that happened to admit visitors. It had to function as a serious enterprise. Part cultural site, part preservation project, part regional employer, part carefully managed brand. Sentiment had preserved Biltmore this far only because sentiment had repeatedly submitted to reality. Now reality required structure. Change came gradually, but with discipline. Events, seasonal programming, hospitality, and later the winery broadened the estate's appeal while extending the value of each visit. Agricultural production remained part of the identity. But now it also became part of the guest experience, linking the estate's working past to its commercial present. Yet growth carried its own danger. Every additional visitor represented income, but also wear. Historic houses suffer not only from neglect, but from popularity. Foot traffic grinds surfaces. Climate fluctuates. A successful preservation model had to solve an uncomfortable contradiction. The public had to be invited in, and the fabric of the place had to be protected from the very public sustaining it. That required a level of stewardship as exacting as the original construction. Roof sections needed repair or replacement. Stone had to be cleaned and stabilized where age, weather, and pollution had softened detail. Woodwork demanded conservation rather than casual refinishing. Mechanical systems installed in the 19th century had to be discreetly updated for modern safety and reliability. None of this could be done crudely. A building like Biltmore punishes shortcuts. The labor behind preservation became its own hidden economy. Craftspeople were brought in or trained. Carvers, masons, plasterworkers, metal specialists, conservators, horticultural experts, and systems engineers all became part of the long work of keeping the estate intact. Preservation was not a single campaign with a triumphant conclusion. It was permanent maintenance under historic scrutiny. Modernization, when it came, had to arrive quietly. Climate systems were improved to protect interiors and collections. Security became more sophisticated without becoming visually intrusive. New technologies were introduced only where they could support the estate without diminishing its character. The landscape continued to matter as well. The surviving woodlands were managed with the same long view that had distinguished the estate from the beginning. Ecological health and economic use were not treated as enemies. Habitat restoration, sustainable forestry, and land management remained part of the institution's logic. By the early 21st century, the transformation was unmistakable. Biltmore had become one of the most visited historic houses in the United States, drawing well over 1 million people a year and supporting a workforce vastly larger than the domestic staff George Vanderbilt once employed. Its influence extended far beyond the gates into the economy of Asheville and the wider region. And that is the final irony of Biltmore. It began as a retreat for one man with extraordinary means and uncommon tastes. It endured because later stewards accepted what he could not fully anticipate. Grandeur without adaptation becomes a liability, and preservation without revenue is a fantasy. The house survived not because it remained what it was, but because it learned how to become something else without surrendering its soul. So who paid for Biltmore? George, certainly. The workers who quarried, carved, planted, scrubbed, and repaired it. Edith, who cut into the dream so the dream could live. The family members who professionalized what sentiment alone could not save. And now the public, whose presence underwrites the care of a place once built to exclude them. The deeper price, though, was never purely financial. It was measured in concessions, in reinvention, in the surrender of privacy to permanence. Biltmore survived because the people responsible for it accepted a difficult form of humility. If a great house is to live, it must eventually learn to serve. That is the secret beneath so many American landmarks. They are not preserved by beauty alone. They endure because someone, at the right moment, chooses usefulness over vanity, stewardship over nostalgia, and survival over pride.